Thank you for coming back for part two. We will try and figure out how to make sure that you have access to the video if for whatever reason you weren't here. We had planned to have this town hall a while ago on the subject of infrastructure, and then of course we had some news about the Coatesville VA that happened a week or so ago, so we adjusted a little bit, and so we did an earlier session this morning on the VA situation, and then we're doing our session that we planned on right now on infrastructure. So for those of you guys who are new, we try to do town halls like this as regularly as we can with a minimum of one a month, so that we can talk to our community about what's happening in our immediate community, in the Commonwealth, and in the country at large. Just like today, we try to have those town halls be specific and focused on something that's relevant for right now, so that we don't end up having sort of a myriad of issues, and that we end up being able to talk about some specific things that are happening in Washington that affect us here, and vice versa. So today's specific focus will be on infrastructure and the piece of legislation that was passed recently by Congress, by the House and the Senate, and signed by the President a little while ago. So let's go to the next slide. So here we are, we're welcoming, here's the agenda. We are now on the 10:07 portion, and it is 10:09 according to this clock. And the 10:07 portion is our meeting norms. Meeting norms are something that I actually learned from being a teacher. I was a chemistry teacher in North Philadelphia at Simon Gratz, and part of the process of learning how to be a teacher was learning how to manage a classroom, and also how to make sure that we all treat one another with respect and with civility and with decency. I think people come to places like this because they want to learn. They want to be able to engage, and they don't want to walk out feeling like they need to take a nap or a shower. I think that that's probably the important aspect of this. So please treat each other with respect, and I will do the same to you. Please make sure that we stick to our agenda, so that we can make sure that all people have the opportunity to listen and be heard. Please make sure that you're dealing with issues and not people, that you're not being accusatory about particular people, or about ideas. I think it's really important to recognize that every last one of us who are sitting in this room is a patriot. We're all here because we love our country, we're all here because we love our community, and we're all here because we love the people who are in our lives. I would also ask that if you don't understand something, then just ask what's called a clarifying question, which is, I think I heard you say this, can you clarify that that's what you meant, as an example, rather than maybe an accusatory question. And lastly, we will make sure that we're talking about policy and not politics. This is a community, the 6th Congressional District, that is, roughly speaking, 40% Democrat, 40% Republican, and 20% Independent. So this is a very unique community in our country. There aren't very many districts like this. And so we have a responsibility to be purple people here, to listen to one another, to understand that we may have different perspectives, but that we are all really active citizens in our community and deserve respect. So we'll be taking questions from folks much the same way that we did the last town hall that was an hour ago, where you have, I hope, been given a card and you can submit questions. We will be sort of collating those questions so that we don't end up with redundant same questions over and over again, and we can get to as many as possible. So here's what that card looks like. Really important for our office, please make sure that you do put your name and your email on there so that we can follow up with you. Please also make sure that it's legible. My handwriting is atrocious, and so I know that I am the worst one to tell you this, but we want to make sure that we're able to contact you. If for some reason your question doesn't get an answer because either we've run out of time or maybe it was redundant or similar to another question, we will follow up with you within, I think it's 48 hours. Is that what our commitment is? Or 2 business days? So by the end of Wednesday, you will have gotten a call from one of our office members to talk to you about your question. Next slide, please. So this is actually something for your civics engagement for the day. On the top area here is where the congressional district is that you're sitting in right now. The 6th Congressional District is all of Chester County and the lower part of Berks County. It's about 700,000 people that we serve here. And as I mentioned, it's a very eclectic mix. As you also know, in kind of the eastern part of Chester County, you have a lot of suburbs. The western part of Chester County, quite a lot of rural area, a lot of farmland. You have the mushroom capital of the world, lots of dairy. If you go northward, you also know that you have the city of Reading. So you have a really eclectic mix of people and lifestyles that they have as well. This is also unique for a congressional district. Many congressional districts are just one or the other, either urban, suburban, or rural. On the map below, you'll see that this is what the new 6th Congressional District will look like, and that will be as of 2022, the next election that will happen. This is the election that is upcoming in November, and you can see that our district was changed slightly by adding another portion of Berks County as well. This is because in redistricting, Pennsylvania lost a congressional seat. We went from having 18 members of Congress to we'll be having 17 members of Congress because of population loss in the state. And so as a consequence, every member of Congress, or we went from 18 districts to 17 districts, every district had to gain population, and that's why you'll see this district map here. Next slide, please. So this is the topic of today, which is a headline from the Mercury, tout $1.6 billion in infrastructure funds for Pennsylvania bridges and products. This is, as a mention of Houlahan and Chester at Berks County. I wanted to bring this headline to your attention because this is an example that I brought to Washington and have spoken on the House floor about why infrastructure is so important. I had the chance to visit Pepperidge Farm Bakery, which is in our district, which if you haven't had a chance to go to is pretty awesome. I am a huge fan of Pepperidge Farm stuff. In fact, when I was pregnant with my first child, I had a craving for their frozen refrigerator cakes, like nonstop, and I didn't know that it's in our district. That's where we make the frozen refrigerator cakes. But the long story short of this is that that facility is right at the edge of a bridge. And when they finish their frozen refrigerator cakes, they have to load up their trucks about halfway full, because the bridge that those refrigerator cakes have to go over can't hold the capacity of a fully loaded truck. So they end up having to partially load and move freight in a very inefficient way. I mentioned that I taught at Simon Gratz, but before that I was the chief operating officer of a basketball apparel and footwear company. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how to organize freight and how to put shoes in boxes and boxes in boxes and all those other kinds of things. And I can tell you that when you put half of a load of baked goods into a truck, you're losing quite a lot of your profitability. And that is something that we should be thinking about when we think about infrastructure. So this is just a story about a huge investment that we as a nation are going to be putting into bridges and tunnels and roadways and a variety of other things. Next slide. So I'm going to move over here so that I can see you guys better too. So this is one of the things that I also would share with you guys by way of setting the stage. We as a Commonwealth have received a C- in terms of our infrastructure nationwide. And this is an independent group of engineers, of civil engineers who put together a report card on how our nation is doing in infrastructure. And our part of the country is pretty old. You know, we are part of the oldest part of the country, arguably the oldest part of the country here. And as a result, much of our infrastructure is really old and aging and hasn't been invested in a really long time. You also can see that we received a D in inland waterways as well. Pennsylvania, in addition to being, and we have quite a lot of rivers, we have quite a lot of lakes, and as a result, we unfortunately haven't put a lot of investment into that infrastructure as well. And you'll find that this piece of legislation we just passed has quite a lot of resources for water issues as well. So what this means is that we, of course, have huge issues with bridges being in disrepair. You saw probably President Biden visit Pittsburgh a few weeks ago, and a bridge fell the day before, I believe, that he was scheduled to be there. So we want to make sure that that does not happen, and that we're making sure that we're bringing the right resources to our community so that we don't have these interruptions in supply chains, and so that we don't have issues, as we've seen with the most recent storms, with bridges that are even more eroded than they started with. This is a picture of Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh visiting us here. He is the dude, the guy who is in charge of labor. And why is this picture here? Because workforce and workforce development and how people get to and from their jobs is an infrastructure issue. And so we wanted to make sure that we brought the Secretary of Labor here to understand what the challenges were here in Chester County and in Berks County too. Next slide. So here is the infrastructure bill being voted on, and for those of you guys who have watched C-SPAN, this is what you'll see when you see the floor of representatives voting. And so here what you see is how many people still are left to vote. So there's 154 people who haven't voted yet, and then you'll see how people are voting in terms of their party affiliation. This is something that I really want to make sure that we talk about, because the Infrastructure Act is a bipartisan bill. The Senate voted bipartisanly with, I think, 10 or 11 members of the Senate who voted to support this bill, who were Republican, and 50 or so members who were Democratic. And in this time, in this country, that's a hugely bipartisan bill. So that's important. But as important that I want you also to hear is that in the House of Representatives where I work, it was not terribly bipartisan. Only about 13 out of 200 and so Republicans did vote for this bill. So this is on the House side, very largely not bipartisan. On the Senate side was bipartisan. And I think another thing to know is that there's a group called the Problem Solvers that I'm part of. And the Problem Solvers are a group of Democrats and Republicans who come together to try to put legislation forward that we can all agree on. And the bipartisan Problem Solvers put together this infrastructure bill. So the folks that you saw who were voting for it across the aisle, the Republicans voting for this bill, were largely of that Problem Solver group. And that's the group that I'm part of as well. So the birth of the infrastructure bill came out of the House of Representatives, and thankfully we were able to get what is a historic piece of legislation across the finish line. Largest federal investment in bridges since the interstate, largest federal investment in public transit ever, largest federal investment in clean drinking water. So this is a big deal, guys. This is generationally a big deal. Next slide. What does this mean for Pennsylvania? It means that we're going to be getting $11.3 billion in federal highway aid, that we're going to be getting $1.6 for bridges and replacement and repair for 5 years. This is also something I want you guys to take away from this conversation. This is not something that happens today. There's not money that's going to fall on us today. These aren't bridges that are going to be repaired tomorrow. These are things that are going to take a while for the resources to get to us and for the projects to start. $2.8 billion over 5 years for public transportation, SEPTA, Amtrak, those sorts of things. $1.4 for water infrastructure, $171 million for EV charging networks, and this is separate than the money that we're also bringing to Chester County for our EV charging network of our own. $61 million is coming. $6 million is coming to our area. $100 million for broadband internet coverage. Most people, when they think about infrastructure, don't necessarily put in their mind broadband, but it is the web, the internet that connects us as well, just as much as a bridge connects us. And if we saw one thing with COVID, we saw how interdependent we are and how dependent we are on that internet for our work, for our education, for our health care. So this piece of legislation has a very significant part of investment in making sure that everybody has access to rapid broadband. And investment in preventing cyber attacks. If you're following the news with Ukraine right now, you probably are seeing that we're very concerned about cyber attacks coming from Russia. We need as a nation to be protecting our businesses, all of our businesses and ourselves privately as well, from cyber incursions, some of them being malicious coming from state actors like Russia, but many of them coming from people who are engaged in ransomware or those sorts of things. When individuals are hacked, it messes up our lives, right? When businesses are hacked, in many cases the businesses never come back because they end up really suffering from the consequences and the expenses of trying to recover from a cyber attack. Next slide. Here's a slide. I don't know, for those of you guys, I mentioned that I was at And1 and did shipping and freight and infrastructure issues there. My background is in supply chain management. I joke around in Congress that if you had asked a member of Congress 2 years ago what a supply chain was, one member of Congress would have known what it is. And now all of us are experts in supply chains. All of us know what a supply chain is now because of COVID and what's happened with kind of the shocks to our infrastructure, the shocks to our economy as a result of COVID. And so, obviously, global economy, our global economy relies on a global supply chain. There have been significant domino effects of what's happened as a result of COVID on our country. You can see what's happening right now in China, where there's a really large increase in COVID cases. You should expect that there will be an impact on the supply chain as a result of that, because we are interdependent on one another, not just with our relationships with China, but with anybody overseas we manufacture with. This is something that the Congress, the Senate voted on yesterday, and this is a little off topic, but there's a very large piece of legislation called the Competes Act that we're also hoping to push forward, and we've already passed out of the House of Representatives. It's already been passed out of the Senate. Now we have to reconcile it in conference together, and you'll see some pretty significant impact, maybe not only my next time at Town Hall, on how we're bringing back jobs and manufacturing and trying to figure out how to be less dependent on China. Rising production costs. Okay, so the IIJA, coupled with this other piece of legislation, which has to do with shipping reform, is hoping to alleviate some of the concerns that we have with supply chain. Also, for those of you guys who participated in the first town hall, important to know, this is a hugely complicated issue. I can't stand here and tell you that one piece of legislation is going to solve all of our problems in infrastructure. I cannot stand here and tell you that one piece of legislation will solve all of our problems in terms of COVID. But all of the different moving parts are what we are hoping will end up alleviate our stress and suffering. I don't know if you guys remember, but at the beginning of COVID, there was a concern that we would have 20 and 30% unemployment rates in our country as a result of this. This is something that we've been trying to prevent, and the infrastructure package is part of it. The Paycheck Protection Program is part of it. You know, the COVID relief packages have been part of it. So it's all interrelated. Next slide. Why is it important now? I think we've just talked about some of these issues. One of the things that I talked down in Washington to people about is that this community not only was impacted by COVID, but we also have just been hit by not one but two hurricane and flooding events as well. And so some of the infrastructure work that was already in the pipeline, the infrastructure bill that we were already working to pass, thankfully had a lot of pieces in it that would fix our bridges, that would help us with water runoff, and we will be able to take advantage of those more quickly because we have more evidence than most people do of what the problem is. We have bridges just around the corner from here that have been decimated as a result of the floods. So these are all the things that we are able to address with the infrastructure package. Next slide. What comes next is implementation, and that's the other thing I want to make sure that you guys come away from this is, there is really an expectation. Seriously, people call the office all the time saying, why isn't this bridge fixed? You know, why isn't this money that came from the infrastructure helping, you know, open the Coatesville train station or provide Amtrak service to fill in the blank? It's coming. It just takes a while. As an example, about 2 weeks ago, I passed the appropriations bill in Congress. I passed the infrastructure bill that's talked about all this money, but that allocated the resources for the infrastructure bill. You have to take another vote to actually unlock the money, and the appropriations vote was only taken a couple weeks ago. So that money has now been unlocked and is now going to various states and local municipalities as the legislation provides. But only 2 weeks ago did the money start to go to communities. If you are seeing construction right now or things that look like infrastructure right now, it's largely as a result of the pandemic relief processes that have been happening. We've been able to use some of that legislation for those kinds of issues. And so the monies are coming from different places. as an example, schools. There was quite a lot of money in the pandemic relief packages to get schools to be, in some cases, modernized, to get better HVAC systems, better plumbing systems, water systems as well. That came from COVID relief rather than infrastructure. Then the last thing before I leave this is there's two different ways that this money will be allocated. One is on the right-hand side where it's like formula funding. Every state gets a certain amount. It's determined by population and need and all that kind of stuff. But on the other side is the part that I've been trying to advocate for here in our community, which is competitive grants, where we can actually compete for big pockets of money. And what I've been encouraging all of us to do is compete. Work with my office, work with your state offices. This is money that is available for anybody who submits grant proposals and that sort of thing in a competitive process. And if we don't get what we don't ask for. And I think that that's something that our state doesn't do a terribly good job of sometimes. We are constantly lapped by places like New York and California and New Jersey, where they're much more sharp-elbowed than we tend to be. And I really need us to be very sharp-elbowed with these resources. These are generational resources that we need to get on board with. Happy to answer any questions for you at our offices on how to do that. Next slide. Beyond roads and bridges, we talked a little bit about some of the other things that are included, including broadband access to make sure that we're connected. Quite a lot of money that is going to be coming to our community in airports as well. We have a few local airports that will be getting quite a lot of resources to be able to build hangars and extended runways and that sort of thing. So that's good. And then the Paycheck Protection Program. For those of you guys who are small business owners, many of you were able to avail yourselves of the Paycheck Protection Program. And I think that has, in many cases, saved businesses from the pandemic. Next slide. Okay, so this is, I think, the final slide. Feels like, yeah, of something else that is not the infrastructure bill, but is in some cases related to it. This is something that was brought back this year in Congress. It's called the Community Protection or Project Funding. What it is a process. It's a competitive process where every congressional district puts forward proposed ideas and proposed requests for the budget process, for the appropriations process that come from our community. So our community, we organized a task force, we organized a process and an application process, and we had an independent group that met to try to recommend to our office which of the projects that came out of our community were worthy to be put forward federally, nationally, to be considered for this competitive program. So what happened as a result is about a year and a half later, we just received about 2 weeks ago these resources or the authority to get this money, the authorization to get this money. So these were some of the projects that were submitted from our community that the federal government will be funding as a result of the Community Project Funding Act. And so, as an example, Borough of Sinking Spring, this is an infrastructure project. They have a real issue with traffic where people have a hard time coming in and out of Sinking Spring, and they really worry, and I think appropriately, that hinders growth. It impedes growth in their area. So this is quite a lot of resources to be able to change traffic flows in the Sinking Spring area so that more people can come and avail themselves of their downtown area. $750,000 for the County of Berks, $645,000, and I'm looking to see if this is the EVU station. I think it might be for Chester County. Chester County put forward a proposal to have better EV access in our county, and that was received and awarded. Lots of $1.4 million for Albright College. That's for a STEM, a kind of science, technology, engineering, and math program. So what you're seeing here is the result of all of the requests that came from our community, and I think it adds up to somewhere north of $6 million, as I recall. $6.3 million. So we will continue to do this process. So if you guys would like to submit ideas and projects for the next round of funding, please access one of my team members to do that as well. Next. That concludes kind of the formal part of the presentation. And now I guess we're moving on to the questions, which if you have any questions, please remember to give them. Aubrey is standing there waving over there. I have a few members of my team here, and I will turn it over for the Inquisition.
Where you go? So we'll start out with a kind of where legislation is right now with energy bills and infrastructure. So there's a lot of people that are worried about the climate change and energy crisis, especially with what's going on in Ukraine. So can you speak to your ideas and goals about how to tackle energy independence?
So a couple things. That's a complicated question, and I'll try to give it the time that it deserves. We have an issue with energy in this country and in the world. We need to make sure that we are moving as rapidly as we can towards a sustainable energy that is renewable, and we need to be making sure that we are independent to the degree that we can of other outside countries for our access to energy sources. Full stop. The ways that we can do that are complicated and many. One is through changing our consumption patterns and changing the ways that we use energy towards more renewables, towards more kind of healthy for the planet solutions. Some of the legislation that is in what's called Build Back Better, which is apparently now changing its name for the third or fourth time, has a significant amount of resources committed to moving this country into sustainable, renewable energy supplies so that we are better for the planet, but also independent of other countries and their supplies. It looks as though that part of the package, the Build Back Better package, which is a significant part of that piece of legislation, almost half of that piece of legislation is related to energy and related to climate, might still have a possibility of coming back to life and getting voted on in the Senate, and then hopefully coming back to the Congress for us to approve. So that's one way that we should be thinking aggressively about making sure that we're independent of other countries and their energy supplies, but that we're also moving to a recognition that our country is really in danger and our planet is in danger if we don't change our behavior. So we definitely need to change our behavior. In the short term, I very much pushed this administration to eliminate our dependence on Russian oil and gas. I have also pushed the administration to think about what it is that we can be doing within our country on all of the areas that we can produce energy, whether it's incentivizing safer, more renewable energy, or whether it's bringing all of our rigs back up to production capacity. Right now, some of our rigs are still not back up and operating from before COVID. Many of them shut down during COVID because there wasn't a demand. And so we still have the ability within the capacity we already have with either rigs that are not operating or with permits that we have to increase that aspect of energy independence. But we also really have quite a lot of work that we should be doing with respect to energy independence as well. I'm trying to make sure I hit everything. I talked a bit about the Build Back Better aspects. It's looking like Senator Manchin on the Senate side is making noise, which is good, that he might be willing to move on with that. As well, he's making noise that he might be willing to move on with reduction of prescription drug pricing, which is awesome. And so if that kind of comes to fruition, then that part of the legislation will come forward. I want to make sure that I also hit on the fact that we need to be moving away from our dependence on other nations' oil and gas, and then we need to be thoughtful about how we ramp up our oil and gas here in our country. The last thing I will tell you is anecdotally. I'm still trying to connect these pieces in my mind, but Coatesville has Sikorsky Helicopter Factory. Sikorsky's helicopters are Marine One, right? They're the helicopter that the president flies around in when he flies around in helicopters. But they're also mostly helicopters that were manufactured for going to and from oil rigs. One of the reasons why Sikorsky is no longer able to maintain its production is because oil rigs were shutting down and not necessary anymore. So I'm actually just trying to noodle over what the implication is here of what's happening as a consequence. But when we saw during COVID, we saw the price of gas go way down. And I remember thinking, gosh, I wish I had somewhere to go because it's really cheap. And now, of course, we're seeing it come back up because we have somewhere to go, amongst other challenges.
So just as a follow-up to that, once the legislation is in place, what can citizens do to help it pass?
Okay, that's a great question. Advocate. I think that one of the things that I tell anybody who asks me, there's nothing bad about lobbying for something that you want or advocating for something that you think is important. We get, as I mentioned in the last town hall an hour ago, we get about 10,000 calls every month to our office. Please call our office and please let us know what you're thinking about and do it constructively, as we talked about, and do it politely. Please don't yell at my team members. And if you have something good to say, please give them a call too. That's helpful too. But what I would say is if you see something, say something is the best resource that you guys have. Call our offices, call your senators as well, call your state and local representatives and officials as well to let them know that these things are important to them because we keep track. And what I would also say is the way that you call that is most effective or that you write that is most effective is literally pick up the phone. Have a conversation. Don't have something that's scripted. Don't click on a button to send in a comment to some email that you're responding to of like, call your congressperson. Do it independently and individually because we also know as offices when something's coming in organically that it's actually driven by you and when it's coming in sort of from the world of, tell your congressperson to do whatever. And it's not that we don't listen as much, but we understand it's a different kind of call that's coming from an individual than it is coming from a movement, so to speak. So please do, express yourself independently.
What is the Congress, Senate doing anything, are they doing anything about trying to achieve net zero carbon?
The question is the Congress trying to do anything to achieve net zero carbon and emissions? That's also a complicated question. There are several different pieces of legislation that are about energy independence by certain years, 2035, 2050. There are also certain pieces of legislation that are about carbon reduction and carbon sequestration and carbon purchasing. And so what I would also say to you guys is when you're out there being your advocate selves, look for those pieces of legislation that resonate with you and call your member and say, for instance, I'm on a piece of legislation that Representative Ted Lieu put forward that's on carbon neutrality, net neutrality, that's a totally different issue. Carbon neutrality by 2035. And so the other thing that's interesting from a civics perspective is every 2 years, literally every 2 years, we get elected, hopefully, and then every 2 years, the legislative process starts over again. So something that was introduced in the last Congress has to be reintroduced in this Congress, and then the process of supporting it or voting for it or whatever has to start all over again. So it's a flushing of the system every 2 years, and also to let you guys know there's about 7,000 pieces of legislation that are put forward every 2 years, and only a few hundred of them actually get a vote, and then only 100 to 200 of them actually get passed and put on the president's desk for signature. So this is why sometimes when you talk to your member of Congress and you're trying to understand, why don't you know about this piece of legislation? Well, there's probably 7,000 pieces of legislation out there, and there may be 5 or 6 that are addressing the same issue but in a different way. So you want to make sure you're talking about, that piece of legislation who's supported by that, that member from that committee or whatever. So just help us, think about the issues that are important to you, and we will help try to make sure that we put our names on those legislative ideas. Another thing that's really important to me is putting my name on ideas that actually have a chance of happening. I don't like signature, statement things. I'm trying to do things that are bipartisan. I'm trying to look for something that's coming out of a committee of jurisdiction that actually might have possibility of passing a piece of legislation. I'm trying not to be putting our names on things that don't have real hope of going somewhere. Just one question over here. I don't know if we're going to do it. You're welcome to write your question.
Yeah, my question's a little bit more detailed, so writing it down is a little difficult. I'm the Veteran Services Coordinator for Delaware County Community College. So today I came because
Yeah.
both meetings relate. And basically what it comes down to is you're speaking about grants in regards to workforce development. You just mentioned some. We received an $80,000 grant from the Delaware County Workforce Development Board for veteran workforce development. That grant money is used to create scholarships fully funded for non-credit certifications like CDLs, realtor licenses, things like that. I do not have the ability, due to local legislation, to be able to give those grants and scholarships to your community that Delaware County serves. My Chester County residents that make up nearly half of my veteran demographic at Delaware County Community College are not able to receive this funding. I have a very big issue with that because, again, that's half of my demographic who are unavailable. So my question to you is, how do you plan on ensuring the fact that state and local governments aren't overly legislating the way in which this funding is spent and available?
So what I'll do, if it's okay, Sue's right here, and she's going to give you her card, and
Thank
we
you.
will address your specific issue. But I will say that this is an example of something that happens fairly frequently, which is Congress legislates something, and then the execution, whether it's with the administration or with its state and local government or whatever, it comes in a different flavor or not at all. And so when we see things like that, we're able to say, hey, that's not what we intended. That was literally not the intent of Congress. You know, here's a fix for that. Whether or not we're able to get those things fixed, that's a different story because, again, there's a legislative process that has to go through and enough people have to believe that this is an issue that it gets to the floor and that we make it one of those very precious votes happen. But we will absolutely try and understand what's going on here. And this may be a case study that we're able to bring back to Washington to try to loosen things up for you. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, so this is, again, a little bit of the VA and so can the city be allotted infrastructure funds to hire partners or partner with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to update the city's stormwater management infrastructure, which obviously is in dire.
Yeah. So I don't know that I'm going to be able to give that the detailed answer that you're probably looking for in terms of who's going to do what and how, you know, who's going to get the resources. But I do know that we have huge issues with water here in Coatesville and in Medina as well, in Phoenixville, a variety of other places as a result of the exposure that we've seen through climate change with all the weather events that we've been having. So I don't know how the money's going to come down. This is part of the what happens next process. Sometimes it depends on the population of a community. So for example, for COVID relief, the city of Reading was able to get money directly from the federal government because they were a big enough city to get money directly from the federal government, and the legislation organized it that way. So sometimes it looks confusing from the outside, of like, why are they getting money directly from the federal government and we have to go through all these other kinds of things? Sometimes it has to do with the population of your community and the organizational structure, or whether you're a borough or a township or whatever, and the formula funding. So it's all very, very, very complicated. So unfortunately, I don't know that I'm going to be able to get you an answer now, but I will ask John to help us get, you know, a more specific answer for that.
And can infrastructure funds be spent to improve the historic VA?
This came up in the last set of questions, was can we use our money, the infrastructure money, to fix the VA? I don't think it's a bad question. I think we should look into it. I don't know the answer to that. It also came up whether or not we can use this, whether or not the VA is a historic building in and of itself, and therefore deserves or could merit being able to be repaired or brought up to code, so to speak, as a consequence of its historic status. Also do not know the answer to that question, and we'll be happy to look into it with all of us.
A couple of questions directly related to the city of Coatesville. Do infrastructure funds or can infrastructure funds be used to support the building of a community center and a smart workforce education ecosystem?
There is some creative work that can be done with some of the pandemic funds that we have passed. there are still resources available as a result of that can be very, very creatively used, and I would encourage our creative thought process on that. An example is we have a workforce issue with STEM professionals. We have a workforce issue with nursing in particular, as STEM professionals are nurses. And some of the resources that came through the pandemic packages are about making sure that we keep those resources post-pandemic. Some of the concerns right now, though, are the money was originally allocated only for COVID response, right? Only when there's COVID in your community can you use this money for these nurses. Well, the issue is part of the reason why there's COVID in our community and that we struggle is because we didn't have enough nurses. We didn't have, Chester County thankfully did have its own health department, but 50 or so other counties in Pennsylvania didn't. And so once all of COVID goes away, it doesn't mean that all of our requirements for being healthy and taking the lessons learned go away. So we're fighting to make sure that some of the resources that may not be obviously used for COVID any longer are still here resident in our community and being able to be used for things like, we have one up in Reading, we have a community college that has a nursing program as an example that has twice as many people applying for it as they have spots available. And we have a huge crisis for nurses. And so isn't there a way that we could use some of these COVID money to educate more nurses to be able to have a better pipeline for nurses or a community center or those kinds of things. I don't know how you make sure that you are writing the grant the exact right way to make sure that it kind of comes through for the exact purpose that you're looking for it. But I can say, and I said this before, this is competitive, guys. Like, we need to figure out how to write our grants so that we can take advantage of the money.
How can the existing fiber optic infrastructure be leveraged to bring in high-tech incubators to you?
I know that there's a project going on in Exton at the state level that is also sounds a little bit like that. And so for the person who asked that question, and I remember talking to you about it, I'd like to try to connect you with the state legislature who worked on that particular project for Exton to see what we can do about centers and incubators and also data centers that are getting built in our community. So could you raise your hand if you're that person? I know I've talked to you. Yes, can we talk to you about the Exton project? That'd be great.
And just going back to the VA, where some folks came a little bit after. Are there any recent updates, and I know you gave a few updates earlier, on the status of Brandywine and Jennerville's hospital? If the VA hospital will close or potentially close, there is a concern of loss of jobs, which obviously would be devastating for this area.
So I am involved to the degree that I'm able to be involved ethically with helping to make sure that we end up with a solution for those two hospitals that ends up providing care for us in our community. These are business decisions. I said this in the last meeting. That particular Tower Health made a choice to shutter those two facilities. And of course, it's not the optimal choice for us as members of our community, but it's their business choice. So what we can do now is figure out how to change their minds one way or the other. There's not going to be a change in their minds that they're going to keep it open or reopen it, but there can be a way where it can land with another organization, for-profit, non-profit, that wants to take responsibility for those two facilities, that wants it to be what it was intended for in the case of Brandywine, to be the mental health facility, or the others to make sure that we have emergency facilities. And there is interest in that, meaning that there are possible opportunities there. That's about as much as I'm able to say. And I also try to keep my ears closed to actual names as well, because I need to make sure I'm walking a really hard and fine line on the ethics of this, that I make sure that if we're able to bring resources to whomever it is who's interested in keeping these facilities open, that we can, whether it's federal resources or state resources. But this is the place where the government should not intervene in our, we can find other ways to be intervening, but this is part of how the capitalism works, guys. That's how this all works. But I have hope, is I guess my bottom line.
There is a concern concern about the legislation that sometimes now decisions are made without research, without getting into the community, learning and seeing what's going on.
Yeah.
What is Congress, Senate, what are you guys doing to safeguard that from happening?
It's a problem, and it's not just a problem with what's going on with the VA. There were a lot of good questions in the last session about, who made this decision, who sat here, and who visited. I wasn't asked, and those are fair questions, and so that's part of the process with the VA, where we're bringing the secretary, I hope, here. We're hoping to make sure that he has conversations with people who are really affected by it, whether people who are part of the workforce here, whether it's people who are veterans themselves who are using the VA facilities, or whether it's him just understanding kind of the lay of the land. I was talking in the last session about what the geography of where it is that we live looks like, and how hard it is to get from here to King of Prussia, as an example, or from here to Delaware. So it's not an optimal process, is the bottom line. Any process that of trying to understand big systems is hard, and is it ever going to be perfect? No. Another example. When I showed you guys the congressional map, we had a lot of people helping us nationally on what the congressional maps ought to look like. But these were people who don't live here, and they don't understand where communities are and how people drive and commute, and how people are interacting with each other in terms of their jobs and things like that. That's why these decisions, in some cases, are better served locally. But in the case of something like the VA, it's a federal organization, so the decisions have to at least start at the federal level. And as I tried to emphasize in the last meeting with you guys, this is, in the VA's case, it's a proposal. It's the beginning of a process that will take years in order for it to resolve itself. And hopefully you guys, for those of you who weren't here for the first conversation, the room was full of people, and I'm very, very grateful that people showed up to have these conversations.
Do you know how much money Chester County Airport will receive for the hangars and the runways?
Well, we had that on one of the slides. I don't know that that's the full amount that Chester County Airport is going to be getting, because I think there are other, Aubrey?
745.
745.
For smaller airports, it was a consistent number. So that is 3 additional airports in Chester County and other roads as well.
We have quite a lot of smaller airports in our area, so that I think I've visited 2 of them so far in the last couple of months, and they have been very, very excited about the opportunities to expand and modernize.
All right. Question, why does Albright College get 1.2?
You cannot get what you don't ask for.
University only 1175.
Yes, well, and that's a great question. So these are specific projects. Literally, Albright submitted their proposal and their request, and it went through the process, and it was for a specific purpose. And Lincoln submitted their proposal and their price tag and their process, and for a specific purpose. It was not at all this, well, they'll get more. This is what people ask for. This is literally what they asked for, is what they got. And so, you cannot get what you don't ask for. This is a process that's going to happen every couple of years, I hope, because it's the first year that it's happened in a long time. And so if you'd like to get on that, on that process, get involved, get engaged, and we'd be happy to work with you guys on that.
I have a few questions that are more coastal related, but if you'd like to hear them.
More closely related? Sure.
More coastal related.
Oh, Coatesville related.
What can be done to fix the smell of the American water sewage plant in Southwood?
I don't know.
But these are things we want.
Inquiring minds.
Inquiring minds.
One more question? Oh yeah, I gotta get to Washington. I just looked at the clock.
I think that's it. The other question, again, it's coastal related, and for those of you who are asking the coastal specific, Congresswoman doesn't really deal with coastal specific related. That's say Ricky here. That's something that you can ask me or Ricky Campbell, state representative, be involved in other things coastal related, like the construction of the train station than happy to field those questions. Also about the potholes on Lincoln Highway, I can address those for you. But I appreciate the questions.
Quick question. So who, if we were looking at competitive bid and putting a proposal together, who would be the person or the committee in Coatesville that would help to create that and then look for evidence? As you said, grants have to have a lot of specific evidence and data to justify their funding. So
Competitive bid for what?
maybe for a nursing school up at Brandywine Hospital, or to expand Hartman College's nursing program here, or to expand Chesapeake's health services, because we may be the last standing opportunity. Who puts that proposal together?
Well, those particular organizations that you mentioned, they would be the lead or the principal applicants. And the city or Christie's office or state representative office, we would be supporting the forces of a particular proposal.
Yeah, our office, and I'm sure all of the offices as well, we can write letters of support for these grants, and they really do help. So if you're putting forward any sort of idea, please let our office know. I think Sue just gave you our card, that we can write a letter of support, and we very much take pride in the fact that those, I think, are helpful. If it's okay, I will close out now. Yeah, thank you for the questions, and I hope that you guys appreciate that this format is sort of designed to try to help make sure that all people are heard, even people who don't feel comfortable maybe standing up and asking a question have the ability to ask in this way. I don't know if in this case if we got to everybody or not, but if we didn't, we will get back to you guys in 48 hours or 2 business days. I have a little bit of prepared closing remarks that I will give you because it's important that I start where I began, which is to thank you guys for coming here today. These conversations and these opportunities to talk to each other and see one another, especially in this difficult environment, is really important. I really want to thank you, James, for being here and for supporting me in this way, and for being the moderator in our conversation today. We could all please give you a round of applause. And I really do want to emphasize that community is really special. We do come from a really important part of the country. There's a reason why politics sort of land in the Keystone State and the conversations are here. We are a complicated community, and I talk about you all the time on the House floor, which is where I'm heading 3 minutes ago. So I want to make sure that I have the opportunity to thank you, but also to describe what I do talk about in Washington to people, which is that you all here, particularly in Coatesville, are crazy resilient. And that's a word that I use all the time. Hurricanes and floods, community leaders are always coming together in this community. It's a friendly place, and I love to be here. But this is a city that has literally forged many of the things, the buildings of our nation on its back. But I want to say that resilience, in my opinion, does have its limits. When I was teaching at Gratz, one of the words that they kept using for the teachers was, "You need more grit." And I kind of got tired of feeling like I was being asked to just be the ball, be the only person who needed, more steel or more strength. So I do recognize that there are limits to that, and that's my responsibility to try and help bring that burden and help you guys with the issues that you're being challenged with your businesses, or trucks not delivering goods on time, old infrastructure, or students who are struggling to be able to have the skills that they need in this particular time. So that's what my responsibility is to try to be our voice down in Washington. Our neighbors and our students deserve the same economic opportunities that people have all over our country. We deserve to be competitive with not just our community and our Commonwealth and our country, but with the world. When we're out for jobs, we have to know that we're out for jobs against not just our neighbors, but people who come from all over the place. And that's why the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that we were talking about today is just so important. It's the literal pathways that get us to those opportunities. We won't succeed if we don't have the opportunity to complement that with some other work that we have. So there is some other work to be done. It's something that I say pretty consistently. These are not perfect solutions. These are not final solutions. But these are the beginnings of what I hope will be solutions that will bring us prosperity and opportunity to this community. You guys have called this area home for generations. We are very much hopeful that we're able to continue to make sure that the next generations have the opportunities to live here safely with an economy that's thriving. And I know that with your support and with the work that we're doing both here in our community and down in Washington, that we will hopefully accomplish that together. So thank you so much for the chance to talk to you guys. I am unfortunately late, and I do need to catch a train, so I likely won't be able to stay and say hi to you independently, and I apologize for that. But my team is here. If you would raise your hand if you're from my team, to answer all your questions or help you to connect with my office further. And thank you.